I would like to start thanking Katia Rijo and Sarah Hope and all the committee from the Image and the Common Ground Research Network for inviting me to deliver this lecture in this conference about the image that is focused on visual pedagogies. And then I would like to focus my conference and my lecture on some pedagogy experiences I've had in two different subjects, but I would like to start giving like a general overview of what this is going to be about. So the lecture is going to be divided into two different parts. First one is going to be centered in how the visual and the spatial narrative work, because they work in a different way than the talk narrative or the written narrative. And then after that, I'm going to be exemplifying how that narrative can be taught in the environment of design and curatorial practice. So the first part is going to be based on to explain this concept. And I'm going to be talking about two main theories that are really important in terms of communication, visual communication especially. The first one is actually Marshall McLuhan, and I'm going to start displaying a video that is going to illustrate very well his main idea.
The medium is the message, declared Marshall McLuhan. He even wrote a book with that name, except that when the proofs came back from the typesetter as the medium is the massage, he liked the mistake in the title so much he kept it. This has confused people ever since, though he might have intended a visual pun on massage and mass age. But what does the medium is the message really mean? It's a deliberately paradoxical statement. When you get a message, it's the message that's the message, isn't it? The content rather than its form. McLuhan's genius was to focus on the medium itself. He argued that throughout history, what has been communicated has been less important than the particular medium through which people communicate. The technology that transfers the message changes us and changes society, the individual, the family, work, leisure, and more. Take the shift from oral cultures to print-based ones, for example. McLuhan thought the printed word encouraged an emphasis on the visual, whereas in earlier oral cultures, when speech was everything, the dominant sense organ had been the ear. The electronic media of his day, the telegraph, radio, television, and the telephone, were, he thought, unifying people and encouraging participation, though perhaps at the expense of greater conformity. What was emerging was some kind of global village. It's almost as if he was writing about the internet.
So why have I played this video? Is just to start stating that there are many ways of communicating. And then if we are in the context of research network, in this case based on the image, we need to be talking about different ways of communicating to the image. So what Marshall McLuhan was mainly saying, he was a very good pioneer and theorist in this field, is that actually the way that we communicate things is even more important than the things that we communicate. That the medium itself is actually, it was explained in the video that there was a mistake, a typo, and the title of the book ended up being the medium is the massage, because it is a massage that somehow configures the way we perceive something. If we're going to be talking about the image as a way of communicating, it is important to learn its own rules, because the image is going to be working very differently as the speaking language or the written one. So this is also important to realize and to acknowledge about it, because if within the frame of the image, I'm going to be talking about how to use pedagogy in a meaningful way, in such a way that the students are going to be able to perceive and to learn how to use this visual language. So, also what Marshall McLuhan was saying is that there's usually in the media, there is a handicap between what you want to communicate and the medium to use. And there is always a delay between that medium and the message. You are, a lot of times in the media, we are using the content of the previous media. So the only way to communicate meaningfully, what he's saying, is to be advanced, one step ahead, and saying that If we understand very well the media, we are going to be able to communicate and to convey a message in a more precise and meaningful way. If that is so, and that is the main, let's say that this, also he was talking about communication and that global village, that was some sort of a prophecy about the internet and how society would be working and also social media. But I wanted to focus mainly on the way that the medium is a message, in the sense that that medium and the way we configure it is pretty important. So, whenever we talk, for instance, about curatorial practices, there is a huge difference in how to tell a story between the narrative of a book, for instance, that has its own structure, its own sequence, its own ways of communicating, like the sequence of a book. It is going to be mainly including text. One page follows the next one. There are some images entangled in text, but the sequence of the narrative is very entangled with the book. For instance, if we think about a book of Dostoevsky, for instance, he was publishing it in a sequence of a newspaper, and the narrative of the story was mainly based on that medium that he was using. So the fact that afterwards we are used to read the whole story and the whole narrative in a row is not how it was intended to be. So we are mainly missing some points about the narrative clues that Dostoevsky was using. So in such a way that there's a difference between how Dostoevsky used to work, used to tell his stories. There's another way. If we go and jump to the curatorial field, it's totally different. The medium that we are using to convey a message, because we are no longer working with narrative based on text or oral language. We only have the image and the space to tell a story. So in order to be able to convey that story, it's not that just we have to know what story we are going to be telling and then translate it in a spatial and visual way. But even more important, if we understand the clues and the dynamics and the features of visual and spatial narratives, we are going to be able to create a message that is adapted to that medium, so that it's going to be way more effective, way more interesting. So it's not a matter of having like a general or universal message that then you translate into different languages. For instance, when you speak in English, the way of thinking is different than when you speak in Spanish. The way you construct the sentences is different. So it's not a matter of thinking of something and then translate it into Spanish or English, but it is a matter of thinking in that language. So whenever we are talking about visual language, we need to be thinking in the visual realm and in the visual and the visual dynamics. And in this case, in the curatorial field, is also really, really important and crucial, the spatial dynamics, because they are ways and the sequence that the space goes, how the visitor moves throughout the exhibition, that is going to be configuring the message in a certain way. And that, for instance, that path that goes within the exhibition is part of how that story is going to be told. That images that are there, the way they relate, the way they appear one after the other, the way that they are configuring the space itself, it's also part of the message. And if you don't have like a full scope of what that language is, you may be losing a lot of potential in the way you communicate ideas and fields in the curatorial field. For instance, here is a very famous schemata of Herbert Bayer of 1935 about the ways he was mainly focused on perception, and that is related with the spatial perception of any human being. But then if we talk also about design in general, in a broader way, not just the curatorial field, we may be talking, we're going to start here a new word that is called creativity. If creativity is something that it is, let's say, the engine that is going to be triggering that language based on the visual reality. How is this going to be working? You may have already heard about Neb Herman, who was the CEO of General Electric. He was also the president of the American Association of Creativity. And he was mainly well known because he developed a theory based on the brain predominances. He was saying that there are 4 different activities that the brain follows. No matter the person, you have 4 ways of using your brain, let's say, in 4 different activities. The first one, the A, is based on the analytic approach. The second one is based on the process. The C1 and third one is based on the interpersonal approach. And then the B is based on creativity and visual thinking. So I'm going to go further. I'm going to go further because actually, in order to be able to convey a message in a visual manner, you need to be also really conscious about the analytical part, the processing and the personal part. But let's say that the visual language is based on this fourth kind of activity. Any person has the four different approaches to use the brain, but there are different predominances, and that is mainly the theory of Ned-Herman, that he's saying that there are people that are more used when facing a situation to use the activity B or the C. There are different predominances, and that is for sure to understand that this is always way more complex, because the person is always way more complex than the four approaches of these four different activities, and each person is a universe. But this is also an interface that helps us to understand how the dynamics of the thinking of the brain works, as many other approaches. But this one is especially interesting because he's talking about the visual narrative and the visual thinking as one of the main powerful parts of the brain activity. And that is the one that we need to be developing and improving a lot in order to be able to be effective in the visual communication, and especially in the visual language. Now I'm going to be talking about another theorist that is now a professor at NYU. He's under Galloway, and he wrote in 2012 this book that is called The Interface Effect, and he's talking about many things, especially most of them based on technology. But one of the main ideas that lies underneath all the message of that book is that whenever two things are related, there's an interface between them. For instance, if we think about the screen of a computer, the screen is actually making visible a reality that is way more complex that we wouldn't be able to manage if it wasn't for the interface itself. And there's a visual, it's like a threshold that relates those two different realities. For Galloway, what he's saying is that the interface, and if we talk not mainly literally as we talk about the screen and a computer, but if we talk in a general way, let's say in a metaphorical way, whenever we understand a reality, there is always that interface that relates different realities, because actually interface, the root of interface, the meaning of interface, goes about the relationship between two different things. What he's explaining, Alexander Galloway, is that the relationship between two things, most of the time, is even more important than the things themselves. And actually, that interaction is able to relate what each one of those has of particular and universal. And the fact that you are comparing two different realities, you can realize what is particular and what is universal in both of them. And the more you have, the more capacity of understanding reality you are going to have. And this is actually something that could be applied. Alexander Galloway is not exactly saying this, but if we go back to the visual thinking, it's also called lateral thinking. Why? Because there is a way of thinking through the visual that goes beyond many other languages. And the visual is actually, the specialty of the visual is to be able to relate, which is, let's say, the basis of creativity, to be able to relate. And that is through visual language and through images. Now we are going to go to explain two different approaches that were my, let's say, pedagogy experience in two different subjects, in two different contexts. But they are going to be actually illustrating, because if we are talking about the universal and the particular, I've been now talking about the universal approach, and what is the concept of the visual language and how does it work, that narrative, and how different that is alongside the spatial narrative to the written one or to any other one. So it looks like it's going to be necessary also to illustrate all this through my particular experience and trying to get from this some interesting ideas that you may find interesting. So I'm going to be talking first about design education. That is going to be the first part. And that design education is based on the first year of design student in the degree that we are teaching here in the University of Navarra, which has two common years that are meant to be foundations of design, and then they choose an itinerary. From the third year onwards, that is fashion design, product design, or service design. But the first 2 years are common. And let's say that when we were launching this degree, we thought about different topics that were meant to be universal in terms that any designer should know those topics, no matter the field within design. So within that constellation, also we wanted to base the learning through projects and condensing in the projects the teaching of all the faculty in order to have all the subjects interacting with the project. Let's say that in that constellation, and each one of the subjects are going to be implementing the knowledge that the students need to know about its own field, but then afterwards evaluating that competencies and skills from the project. But then, let's say that the subject that I'm teaching, that is design studio, is the one centered and focused on the process. So how were we facing this pedagogy in design studio within that frame and that constellation? Let's say that our role in design studio, our role is based on that process, and we want to make the students conscious of the process, because sometimes the students think that creativity pops from nothing, and there is actually a lot of methodology behind it, and there is a lot of potential behind each one of, let's say, the tools that you can use to implement, to trigger creativity and to foster it to its fullest. So part of our system is to teach them. So these are the topics that we cover in the first year that we consider basic for any field of design: typography and composition, color, patterns, design, packaging, upcycling, section segregation. So let's say that the universal language of a design is the visual one, and we are going to be covering those general topics that are universal. How are we meant to be explaining to the students each one of those topics, if not through examples and through images? So what do we do? How do we tackle down these topics? Whenever we start a new project and that new topic, for instance, the first one that is based on typography and graphic design, we cover at the beginning the work of a master of the 20th century of design that was especially interesting for the, let's say, the predominance of his or her work on that particular field. So in this case, the third one is Otelifer. He was a pretty well-known designer that was teaching at Ulm School. And then he was mainly pretty well-known because he was the pioneer of using pictograms, as we see on the right. And he was actually also the designer of the Lufthansa company, all the graphic design in 1974 that he developed with students. But he's actually, nowadays, is still working, and it's actually amazing how current and modern that design for that company is. How do we tackle this? So we actually approach this designer in such a way, and we tell them that it is important, a very important way of triggering creativity is research. So if you learn, because actually, if nothing comes from nothing, you need to be filling the backpack of a lot of references. And not only that, because if there are many references, how do you know which ones are going to be better than others? So there's always this way that it is to step on top of giants. That is a typical sentence that is saying that we need to be able, in order to advance knowledge, we need to be supporting our knowledge from previous advances. Let's say, so if we are talking about design, since design, well, is a soul as human being, but let's say as a discipline per se, let's say that the 20th century was like the blossom of that discipline, okay? So if we get several masters of design of the 20th century, we can get them to be a good example because they have already passed, let's say, the filter of time and the strainer of time, and many critics and many eyes have been behind those, so they are good for a reason. If we talk about those masters, then the students are going to be learning from a master that particular field. What is the second part that we do and that we make them do? We make them analyze contemporary case studies. So in small groups, they are developing and analyzing contemporary case studies, and they need to be able to be very synthetic, and we force them not to be talking about the general context or the designer, but to understand how those particular case studies were important in that particular field. So if we are talking about the initial sequence of Burgerrakum, the movie, we need to ask them to be able to state why that sequence is important from the typographic and graphic design point of view. I am not interested in the music. I am interested in the music, but I want them to be able to explain that case study from that particular point of view of the topic that we are covering. They do have the reference of the master. They do have a lot of reference in the, let's say, universal approach that we have been teaching about typography and graphic design, that they need to implement it and to be able to explain and analyze. If we were talking about Ned Herman, the four predominances, in order to develop fully the approach, the visual approach to this particular case study, they need to be very good analytical they need to do an analytical work before that. Like whenever they have a case study, they need to be able to discover what the inner dynamics are, the causes, the relationships, and let's say the decisions made throughout the process, because those decisions need to be coherent and need to be related, because otherwise it would be not a good design, a design that has unity, but it would be a Frankenstein. A Frankenstein is meant to be any decision is totally unrelated with the next one, so what you get has nothing to do with unity. So good design is always related with unity. And then in order to do so, we need to make them able to analyze first case studies of design and to analyze them through the lens of the particular topic and through the lens of the coherence throughout the process. So that is how we approach it. I'm going to go faster through the other ones because we need to cover now the curatorial field. And then the second master that we talk about on the color project is Oscar Schlemmer. That was, as you already know, he was a good scenographic designer. He was a professor at the Bauhaus. There were many professors at the Bauhaus that were experts in the use of color, like Kandinsky, Joseph Albers. But let's say that Oscar Schlemmer was very much used to relate the color with the meaning. So, for instance, in his famous Triadic ballet, he was using different colors in the background, and it is, let's say, part of what in the Bauhaus was going on, and then he was able to explain very well the color. So whenever we cover that topic, we also make them analyze in small groups different case studies. There's only an example of 4 here, but we cover, let's say, 20 case studies in small groups per topic that we are actually changing from year to year in such a way that whenever they receive the information of general master, they receive an information about the general topic, they prepare and they analyze not only one case study, but then at the same time, afterwards, when they come to class, do a presentation, they learn from their classmates on that analysis of each one of those case studies. So before starting the project about color, they have already received information about Oscar Schlemmer, general approach to color in design, and then 20 case studies, one of them thoroughly approached by them to the analytical point of view. So they got a lot of examples, and that is actually something that is really useful for them to be able to relate those examples and then to be able to trigger their own processes of creativity. If we go to the third topic, that is patterns, we actually picked Joseph and Annie Albert, that they were a couple that were teaching at the Bauhaus and then afterwards moved to Black Mountain College. And then Joseph Albert was pretty well known because of he was talking about the interaction of colors. So whenever we talk about patterns, that it is the repetition of an element under a certain law, it is important to understand how the interaction of colors works. It's a very important point of view. So that is actually also connecting with the color one. And then his wife, that was one of the first female professors at the Bauhaus, that he was the head of the workshop, the weaving workshop at the Bauhaus. She was developing a lot of printed patterns and also press patterns. So, and then they cover again those case studies and they learn to analyze how the dynamics in each one of those studies, they need to learn and to explain what the inner dynamics and what makes that pattern interesting. We are not that much interested in the other context, but we need them to think at them through the lens of pattern. So, and then another innovative teaching project that we developed within this dynamic was the case study analysis through the conceptual and formal analysis. That was the interaction of 3 different subjects: formal image, anthropology, and design studio. And they needed to be analyzing those case studies from those 3 points of view. So that was very enriching to them because they were getting the full scope and the full meaning of each one of those case studies. Not only the inner dynamics of creativity, but also the context and the formal, because the formal is usually always related with the image related. So, and then afterwards, what we are doing and developing with them is a repository of case studies that they are analyzing visually, conceptually, formal, and through the process. And that is a very important part of design education as we understand. So, if we go to the other experience, that is going to go through the curatorial field. In the museum of the university, we have curatorial studies master, and I am teaching there art and space. And I am using the dynamics that I was explaining, but in a more thorough way, because also we don't have 30 students in that master, but people that are a little bit more advanced. So they are able to go further and to implement this dynamic in a further manner. So if we go back to Marshall McLuhan, that the medium is the message, and then we go to Alexander Galloway that explains that the interrelationship between things is very important. What do I do with the curatorial students? I organize them in groups of 5 people, and then each one of those groups needs to choose a topic, whatever they want. But they are going to be looking at that topic from the curatorial point of view and from the visual and spatial narratives. At the beginning, many of them don't have a clue about what I mean when I say visual and spatial narratives. So how they are going to be getting those concepts? By means of learning through examples. Because, for instance, a philosopher is going to be working through concepts, but a designer and a curator works through images. So, and then the way of learning through examples. If they are able to analyze those examples and relate them, they are going to be getting a full scope of how that language works and the inner dynamics. So in 2 years ago, they were choosing these 5 topics. One was related with perception, the other materiality, color, sound, and display. They need to do, it was a two-part work. On the first part was analytical, and they need to select case studies, each one of the 5 students, case studies that were related with the topic. For instance, the ones in perception, 5 exhibitions that one of the main musics of the background is perception. And then afterwards, to be getting the full sense or meaning or dynamic of each one of those exhibitions, by means of relating it to the other ones. So it's a group dynamic in this case. And it is crucial for them, and it is very important to realize that they need to be talking about visual and spatial narrative. And that is always my struggle as professional and their struggle as students to be focusing just on that particular way of conveying the message. So if the first one was perception, that they were focusing between opticality and tactility, there were 5 case studies there. One was The Crown Room by L16. The other one is New Babylon by Constant New House. Then Fantasy Landscape by Werner Panton, Aten Rain by James Turrell, and then 77 Million Paintings by Brian May. So if we go fast in such a way that we can understand fully the scope of how this is working, they started, one of the things was analyzing The Crown Room of L16. I am not going to be thoroughly analyzing each one of those case studies. I just want to illustrate how to be able to relate those 5 different case studies are going to help them. It's going to help them analyze them through a visual narrative point of view, and then by means of relating them, being able to get the full scope. So, L16 and The Crown Room was an experiment he was doing that was related with perception, was very conceptual, and was mainly based on opticality. We are not going to be entering back if we talk about the 19th century. There are a lot of, especially German theorists, that are talking about perception, and there is a huge discussion there between opticality and tactility. Opticality was more related with conceptual perception, and then tactility was more related with that closer perception through the senses. Okay, and there is a tension between those 2 approaches, and they wanted to portray that tension between opticality and tactility in perception through different exhibitions. So this one was totally conceptual, because when Elicit is talking about a very conceptual way of approaching the space, about orientation, there are many different topics that we're covering this. But the fact that they are comparing Elicit Crown Room with these other 4 case studies was able to make them further and to actually to look at that exhibition of Elicit in a way more in-depth manner. Just by means of relating with the other. So if the second one was New Babylon by Constant New House, for instance, in this case, I'm not going to be covering now this particular case study. I am just going to be pointing out that this student had a special struggle because he was focusing too much in trying to explain what Constant and New Babylon, the project of New Babylon, of the Situationists that were a group of urban thinkers. They were focused. And I wasn't that interested in that, but I was interested in how the exhibition of New Babylon that was set up in the Reina Sofia Museum was set up, because actually a very important part of Constance's theory relates with drifting. And actually the exhibition was totally thought out through drifting. So let's say that the interface of the exhibition was explaining very well the content of Constance. So that made him realize that it wasn't that much important to be getting the context, but to be seeing how the language of the exhibition, that was in Constance, actually something pretty more recent, the exhibition, but it was interesting also to relate it with because that also Constance's approach is very tactile. So it was a very good contrast to the Elysic's approach. So if we talk about fantasy landscape, that goes even further, because Werner Panton, Fantasy Landscape, this was a design, an exhibition that was inside a yacht, and then it was based totally in a sensorial perception that was also related with Elysicki, because Elysicki, one of the things that he's more obsessed with is the orientation. So the up and down, it doesn't matter that much, because it's a very conceptual approach to space. But for Bernard Panton, the fact that you are able to feel with the body the space, that is the kinesthetic sense, it was crucial. And also the textures and the colors and everything was very, very sensual, and it was, let's say, the opposite pole to the approach of Elysicki. Then if we talk about Athens Rain of James Turrell, this contemporary artist, we go back again to a very conceptual way of approaching space, but then using color in a very metaphorical manner, even a little bit eerie, a little bit magical, and something that is very conceptual, but at the same time sensorial, but in a totally different way, as Bernard Panton. And then if we go to the last one, 77 Million Paintings by Brian Eno, then this was based on several concepts that were applied in the previous exhibitions, but then Brian Eno was trying to portray also the power of healing through perception, so it was going a further step. The second part of the project was to, based on the analysis of those 5 case studies, the group of the 5, they need to implement and to design a proposal to transform a space in a public building here in Pamplona, and they need to be basing that intervention in the space in the analysis that they had done. So actually they were focusing especially in Athens Rain of James Turrell, but getting a lot of approaches from the previous one, so they were actually developing this magnificent intervention in that building based on all those theories about perception. So they needed not to only to understand, but to implement all that knowledge in a particular approach. So now I'm going to be going fast because there's only 5 minutes left, and then I'm going to be talking about the other topics, but really fast. The second topic was materiality, and the 5 exhibitions, one is Missing Materiality that Anna and Eugenie Bach did in the German Pavilion, Barcelona, in 1929 World Fair in Barcelona, that was rebuilt in the 80s. And a very important part of Mies van der Rohe as an architect is the materiality and all the materials that are used in there. So they were covering all the materials of that building with white surface, with a white surface. So they were kind of denying the materiality of Mies, which is one of the essence, and they need to just test that and see how the space was working. So that is one approach to materiality, actually trying to avoid it in order to get the full extent of space. And then Space Shifters by Cliff Lawson. There were several interventions in that exhibition, but this exhibition was focused on this particular room that was through perception and the materiality through this, let's say, water surface that was reflected the other part of the space. The materiality of the space starts to lose its own meaning in an extent in which the reflection has almost the same materiality of what it reflects, and it changes reality to perception. So if we go to a Japanese translation by Pedro Ganano at the MoMA Museum, it wasn't interesting, and this film also didn't get at the beginning what was important about this, but then at the end he did. It wasn't that important for him to analyze in that exhibition what was the content, who were those Japanese architects that were talking about different topics. What I was interested for him to be focusing was in that exhibition how they were using materiality and transparency as an interface to explain the principles of their architecture. So the way of designing the exhibition, they are using the language of the exhibition to explain the content in a very meaningful manner. Not just a means of explaining, but displaying it visually and spatially. If we go to elements of architecture forecast, it was also the same thing. This was in the Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2014. And then this was the entrance of one of the main buildings of the exhibition. And then actually, what he was saying is that whenever we take a look to the roof or to a ceiling in an interior space, there is way more materiality behind it because there are a lot of fittings and installation going behind it. And the fact that we don't see them, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And it's important. So by means of having a section of the building and seeing how much the different fittings of or installations of a building occupy, that was a way of understanding that. And actually it was very, very, very important, the perception in this space, because before entering underneath that ceiling, you were able to take a look to what was the materiality behind the ceiling. But whenever you were going underneath it, you were losing that perception. But then you were conscious about that materiality behind it. And then the graph Unsale of Christo and Jean-Claude. Christo passed away this year. So it was interesting and important, the fact that when he was wrapping the buildings, there are many theories behind it, but the fact that they changed, they were changing the scale of the buildings by means of wrapping them and transforming them into objects instead of spaces, because usually a building is a space and it is meant to be perceived as a space when you are inside it, and actually it's a landscape within a city. But the fact that you are changing the cover and then you are wrapping it, it makes you understand that building in a different manner. And that was also, let's say, the explanation of those case studies, those 5 case studies, was very ritual for them because they were relating each case study with the other one. And that was really important for them. So let's say that what they were implementing in the design was the re-edition of the Space Shifter flip-flop exhibition, and they were setting up, let's say, different mirrors in the space, in that public space, in such a way that they were kind of calling the attention of several points of view that in a very virtual manner, because the reflection is always virtual and it's not physical or it's not material, but that reality is not less real than the other. So they were actually implementing a very interesting approach to that case. Now we are going to go really fast to these last topics. Color and exhibit independent groups. Hamilton, Passmore, and Alloway, they were designing this exhibition. That was an exhibit, 1957, and they were obsessed on how an exhibition works, the dynamics of an exhibition works through the environmental perception. They were focused on saying, okay, an exhibition is very different from any display in the world. It is a space. So the way that you go through the space is super important. And they were actually using different colors like transparent, red, gray, white. So let's say that the color and the transparency in those colors was a very important way of perceiving and relating that space, because all those, let's say, rectangles in the space, by means of moving, they are actually changing the relationship so you are more aware of the space and how do you move within the space. If we go with film construction ambiguity color, Carlos Diaz, we are going to be getting, there were several rooms, but actually he is very much basing his approach to the Joseph Albers and interaction of color and in the patterns, and actually the way we perceive the dynamics of space through those projections. So that was also very much related to the previous exhibition. Then Rana Begun was doing in Regent's Park this exhibition where several layers of glass, color glasses, and you could actually be moving within them, and you were perceiving the exterior space through that different approach. And then if we go to Color Factory by Bernay, Rosenberg, and Young, they were changing the city of Chicago through changing a lot of public spaces in the use of color and making more people more color conscious. And they were implementing this in the same building through these stairs that actually there's they were implementing the use of color of this, and actually the light going through those filters of color was transforming the space very well, and they were getting a lot of insight from each one of the exhibitions they were analyzing. If we go to the last one, to the previous, second to last, then there's these 5 exhibitions, Listening with the Eyes, that actually was based on the town art of Spain, and the way that we visualize that town art is really Spain. And then it was actually rated with this one by Simone, that was the perception of the space through noise, and how do you move from this within the space, and then how you perceive the space by means of noise. And raw material was a super interesting one, that another exhibition that was happening in the Tate Modern, that they were actually translating the noise of a factory set by different layers, and they were implementing dot noise throughout the space. So it was to perceive a space with the context of the noise of another different space. And what is for the Philips Pavilion, designed by Le Corbusier and Giannis Xenakis in the 1958 Brussels World Fair. And that building was meant to be expressing through mathematics and music. Or this one, I'm almost there, 2 minutes. So this one is a public space that is totally, it was an art that was stated in the street, and then they were actually, let's say, implementing the re-edition in the Curatorial Palace, that they were actually setting up different boxes, cardboard boxes, and setting up different noises, and the position of the space was changing throughout this. The last topic was covering 5 case studies. One is Villabay by Jan Tindelay. That is actually, as you can see, the people are walking. It looks like the floor is this one on the bottom, but the floor is actually the one in the top, in the side. So this was like, let's say, a provocation on how do we perceive and how do we display, and how we are used to be receiving that display. So if we change the rules, suddenly you're more conscious about that display dynamic. If we go to the summer exhibition, then of Grace and Pearl, then let's say that the 250th summer exhibition is an exhibition that has been happening for 250 years, and is usually a miscellaneous mixture of different paintings. But then actually this curator was, let's say, painting the whole interface through his persona and his alter ego. So that was an interesting way of displaying with an interface metaphorically speaking, about the curator, making it very evident when usually a lot of times the interface is meant to be transparent. In this case, it wasn't. Then Citazione Practici, that is an exhibition that was set in Rome to display the work of Fornasetti, that was a designer that was obsessed with the classical art, but then actually by means of comparing his pieces with the references of the pieces, was by means of display and displaying the references that he was obsessed with. It was giving full meaning, as we can see here, for instance, if we see here this classical sculpture, and then all those movements, they are based on these classical compositions. So by means of displaying one or the other, was expressing best that relationship, and it's one of those. If we go to Serial Classic by Oma, it was an interesting exhibition that the main idea was that there's like Salvatore Secchi was the curator, and Ren Coulthard was the exhibition designer. And actually, let's say that one of the most common ways of displaying sculptures is through a plinth. If you remove the plinth, actually, you get a different sense of the sculpture, because usually a plinth makes a sculpture static. If you remove it, you get the dynamic sense of that sculpture. And the fact that you're receiving, for instance, we are used to think about the Michelangelo sculpture of David is only one, but there are many copies. And in the classical world, there are many copies of them. So the fact of displaying all of them alongside together was giving a different sense. On the one hand, the movement, and then on the other hand, that serial approach of classical art, that it looks, or it always seems to be very, let's say, centered on the unity and not in the copy. So by means of displaying and let's say, the dynamics of display, they were able to explain visually and spatially a lot of interesting ideas regarding the exhibition. And then the last one is Savage Beauty, that is Alexander McQueen there was an exhibition of Alexander McQueen created by Bolton and Coda in the Victorian Albert Museum, and the fact that they were displaying the collection and the work of a fashion designer, it was totally changing, because usually, let's say that whenever you are presenting a collection, usually it's for the fashion victims and that particular realm, but then whenever you are displaying it in a museum, the context totally changes, and actually the cultural approach rises. So it's really important that not only the way that you display, but the context in which you display, it gives a lot of value. So let's say that among those 5 examples, they were using by displaying that same space that there's actually in the underground, in the basement of that, there is a 12th century cemetery. And they were actually, let's say, displaying those tombs just by means of marking them in the floor, in the free floor. And it's, I don't know if you can see and perceive here in the upper level also there are 3 tombs. So by means of displaying that, they were making conscious. So the power of display made something that was invisible visible. So my conclusion here of this whole lecture is that, for instance, Nietzsche was saying that nothing comes from nothing. And he is even saying that to choose and to select is already to create. So my personal experience in pedagogy in both design and curatorial practices is based on this case study analysis in such a way that we are forcing the students to create all that constellation of different examples. You meant to be the brain. So the more examples that you have, and the more you are able to analyze and to relate them, and to move from the particular approach to the universal one and the other way around, the more creative you are going to be. So if you get many references, and then you are able to analyze them and to relate them, as Alexander Galloway was saying, then you are going to be very creative. So if we are talking, and we started this lecture talking about the power of the visual language, it's let's say a very important part of the dynamic of the visual language is to be able to have a full scope of many different particular case studies that are going to be able to give you the capacity to create your own images. So thank you very much. I would like to thank again Katia, Sarah, and all the committee from the Common Ground Research Network for inviting me to this lecture, to deliver this lecture. And it's been a pleasure and an honor. And thank you very much.